Welcome to Echoes of Ihsan, the podcast where we like to really kind of dig deep into Islamic wisdom and today we're going deep into the Muwatta Imam Malik,
Okay.
specifically book 30
Oh, wow.
on suckling.
Interesting.
And you might be thinking suckling, like what's so deep about that?
Right.
But trust me, this isn't just about babies and milk.
Okay.
It's about how this seemingly simple act could completely redefine what family meant in early Islamic society.
Okay.
So think of it like this.
Yeah.
What if someone you knew, right, like someone you knew became as close as a sibling to you simply because they were nursed by the same woman as you?
Mm.
Like, it really makes you question, like, what really defines family,
Yeah, what's fascinating about this book, The Muwatta, is it doesn't just present like the concept of suckling creating kinship.
Right.
It gives us these like real life examples and shows us how these rules played out in the early Muslim community,
Yeah.
often with some really surprising results.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. The first part of book 30 really focuses on the suckling of infants.
Right.
The most straightforward scenario.
Yeah.
But even here, things get interesting pretty quickly.
Absolutely.
Right.
One of the most striking stories involves Aisha,
Okay.
the Prophet Muhammad's wife.
Yeah.
And she describes a time when a man wanted to visit Hafsa,
Okay.
another one of the Prophet's wives.
Okay.
Now, this man was Hafsa's paternal uncle, but through suckling,
Okay.
meaning he had been nursed by the same woman who nursed Hafsa's father.
Oh, wow. So it's like they're family, but not through blood.
Right.
But how did this play out in their daily lives? Did they treat each other like family?
That's the key point, right. The Muwatta tells us that Aisha was unsure if this man, being a relative through suckling, was allowed to enter Hafsa's private quarters.
Right.
After all, he wasn't a blood relative,
Right.
so she asks the Prophet Muhammad for clarification.
Okay, so everyone's looking to the Prophet for guidance on this.
Right. And his answer was very clear.
Okay.
Yes, the man could enter. Okay.
The Prophet explained that suckling creates the same prohibitions as blood relationships.
Okay.
So in Islam, these prohibitions define who you can and cannot marry.
Right.
These are known as maram relationships.
Okay.
And these relationships are considered like sacred, inviolable.
Okay, so it's not just a casual, oh, we're kind of like family.
Exactly.
It's a serious bond
Yeah.
with real consequences for how you interact socially and who you can marry.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And we see this play out in another story from the Muwatta.
Okay.
It tells us about Hafsa, who we just mentioned, and her foster son, Asim.
Okay.
She wanted Asim to be considered a true member of the family, someone who could, visit her freely.
But that might have raised some eyebrows. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, adopting a son is one thing,
Right.
but allowing that level of familiarity.
Exactly. You're picking up on the nuances of the situation perfectly.
Yeah.
The Muwatta tells us that to solidify Asim's place in the family, Hafsa arranged for him to be nursed by her sister. Interesting. So that act formally established a kinship bond. It gave him the same access and privileges as a blood relative.
Exactly.
That's interesting. It seems like the women in these cases had a lot of influence over how these familial relationships were formed.
You're right to point that out.
Yeah.
It highlights the important role women played in shaping these kinship networks.
Yeah.
And there's another detail about Hafsa's story that's worth noting.
Okay.
Remember Aisha, who we spoke about earlier?
Yeah.
Well, she was very particular about who could visit her.
Okay.
She only allowed those who had been nursed by her sisters or nieces to enter her private quarters.
Wow. So it wasn't just any instance of suckling.
Exactly.
It mattered. Like, the lineage of the woman who nursed you also mattered.
Exactly.
That adds another layer of complexity to this whole system.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
It just shows how interwoven these practices were with the entire social fabric of the time.
Yeah.
And the Muwatta gets even more specific about how this kinship bond was established. It lays out that 5 instances of breastfeeding were needed to create this tie.
5 specific instances.
Yeah, 5 specific instances.
Was there a reason for that number?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the Muwatta doesn't explicitly say.
Okay.
It does, however, emphasize that even a single drop of milk ingested by the child before the age of 2
Wow.
could create this bond.
Really?
This seemingly minor detail speaks volumes about the weight given to even the smallest amount of breast milk.
So imagine that. Just a single drop could alter a child's entire social landscape.
Right.
Family ties, and even who they could marry later in life.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it really puts into perspective the power of this act in that context.
You've grasped the core of it.
Yeah.
This seemingly simple act had the power to reshape entire family structures.
Yeah.
It's mind-boggling when you think about it.
This is all so fascinating.
Right.
But I have to ask, what about adults? Could they become family through breastfeeding?
That's where we move into the next section of the Muwatta. And trust me, it gets even more thought-provoking.
Okay.
It delves into the debate over whether or not suckling could create kinship bonds between adults.
Oh, okay.
The Muwatta lays out some really compelling arguments on both sides.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. Let's dive into those arguments and see what the Muwatta reveals about this more complex side of suckling and kinship.
Let's do it.
All right.
So you're curious about whether adults could become family through breastfeeding.
Yeah, it just seems a little, I don't know.
Right, well, the Muwatta recounts a story about Salim,
Okay.
a freed slave who was adopted by a man named Abu Huzaifa.
Okay, so we're talking about adoption in this case.
Right.
How does breastfeeding come into play here?
Well, Abu Huzaifa's wife,
Okay.
Salah,
Okay.
she deeply cared for Salim, and she wanted him to be like a son to her,
Right.
even after his adoption.
Okay.
This meant she desired the kind of close relationship where he could enter her private quarters
Okay.
without any social awkwardness or impropriety.
But wouldn't that have been a problem given the social norms of the time?
Yes.
I mean, a freed slave, even if adopted, wouldn't automatically be considered a mahram relative, right?
Exactly, and that's what makes the story so intriguing.
Yeah.
It presented a real social dilemma.
Right.
The Muwatta tells us that the Prophet Muhammad, when consulted about this issue,
Yeah.
offered a surprising solution. Salah should breastfeed Salim 5 times.
Wait, really? The Prophet suggested that a grown woman breastfeed an adult man
Right.
to make him like a son. That seems unconventional, to say the least.
It definitely challenges our modern sensibilities, but remember, we're trying to understand the context of early Islamic society.
Okay.
The Prophet's suggestion was a way to navigate a complex social situation
Yeah.
while adhering to the principles of mahram relationships.
Oh, I see.
By breastfeeding Salim, Salah would be establishing a kinship bond that would allow for the close familial interaction that she desired.
I see. It's like they were using the existing rules about suckling and kinship to create a solution for a new and unusual situation.
Exactly.
But I imagine this must have sparked some debate.
Of course.
Right. Not everyone would have been comfortable with the idea of an adult woman breastfeeding a grown man.
You're absolutely right. The Muwatta reveals that this particular case generated different opinions among the early Muslims.
Okay.
Some of the Prophet's other wives disagreed with this application of the suckling rule,
Okay.
arguing that it was a very specific exception made for Salim's unique situation.
So they might have felt like this was stretching the concept of suckling for kinship a bit too far.
Right.
What other viewpoints are in the Muwatta?
Well, the Muwatta also presents the perspective of Umar ibn al-Khattab,
Okay.
a prominent figure in early Islam.
Right.
And he firmly rejected the idea of using adult breastfeeding to create kinship,
Okay.
emphasizing that such bonds should be based on blood ties.
So we have a range of interpretations and applications of this concept.
Right.
Some saw it as flexible and adaptable to various situations, while others held a stricter view. It's fascinating to see these debates unfold even in the earliest days of Islam.
It certainly highlights the complexity of applying ancient principles
Yeah.
to new and evolving social contexts.
Right.
And it reminds us that interpreting religious texts isn't always straightforward.
Yeah.
There can be room for different understandings and approaches.
Okay, so we've seen how suckling could shape family ties and even solve social dilemmas.
Yes.
But the Muwatta also touches on some other intriguing aspects of breastfeeding, right?
Uh-huh.
What about the impact of suckling on marital relations?
You're referring to the concept of gila,
Yes, Gila.
which is the practice of a husband having sexual relations with his wife while she's breastfeeding.
Now, that's a topic that deserves careful consideration.
Right.
It's interesting to see how breastfeeding practices intersected with various aspects of life in early Islamic society.
Absolutely.
Before we delve into the specifics of Gila, can you give us some context? Was this practice common at the time?
It seems that gila was a prevalent custom in various cultures during that era. Okay.
The Muwatta records that the Prophet Muhammad initially considered prohibiting Gila altogether.
Imagine the social shift that would have entailed.
Right.
It would have been a significant change.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what considerations led him to contemplate such a prohibition.
Mm.
Were there concerns about the impact on the child?
Mm.
Or perhaps social anxieties about the practice?
Those are all valid questions.
Yeah.
And while the Muwatta doesn't explicitly delve into the Prophet's initial reasoning,
Okay.
it does reveal that he ultimately chose not to prohibit Gila.
Okay.
This decision, it seems, stemmed from his observations of other cultures.
Okay.
He noted that both the Greeks and Persians, for instance, practiced Gila without any apparent detrimental effects on their children.
So rather than imposing a strict prohibition, the Prophet Muhammad opted for a more pragmatic approach,
Yes.
taking into account existing cultural practices and weighing potential consequences.
Exactly.
It seems he was striving to establish guidelines that were both rooted in principle and adaptable to the realities of the time. Precisely, and this example demonstrates the dynamic interplay between revelation,
Yeah.
cultural context, and practical considerations in the development of Islamic law.
Right.
But while Gila was ultimately permitted, the Muwatta doesn't shy away from laying down clear rulings about breastfeeding for kinship.
Right. We talked earlier about how 5 instances of breastfeeding were needed to create that familial bond.
Uh-huh.
But was there a time limit on when this suckling had to occur?
Absolutely. The Muwatta unequivocally states that breastfeeding for the purpose of establishing kinship must happen within the first 2 years of a child's life.
So after those 2 years, breastfeeding is just about nourishment,
Right.
not about forging family ties.
Yeah.
It's like there's a clear boundary.
Yes, you could say that.
It's fascinating how specific these rules were.
Right.
And it makes you wonder, why 2 years? Was there a biological reason behind this time frame? Or was it more about social conventions?
It definitely raises some intriguing questions.
What's also striking is how this clear-cut rule about the age limit contrasts with the ambiguity surrounding the cases involving adults like Salim.
Right.
It highlights the evolving nature of interpreting religious texts
Yes.
and the complexities of navigating different social situations.
Indeed.
And this nuanced understanding of suckling and its implications in early Islamic society leads us to a final, fascinating detail about what exactly constituted a suckling.
Okay.
Remember, the Muwatta mentions that 5 instances were needed to create a kinship bond.
Right.
But what exactly did that entail?
Right.
What defined a single instance of breastfeeding? Did the child have to nurse for a specific amount of time, or was it something else?
You've hit on a key point. The Muwatta doesn't specify a duration for each suckling instance. What it does emphasize is that even a single drop of milk,
Wow.
as long as it's swallowed by the child within those crucial first 2 years,
Right.
counts towards establishing the kinship bond.
So it's not about the amount of milk, but the act of ingestion itself.
Yeah.
That's a fascinating level of detail.
It is.
It really underscores the power attributed to breast milk in this context.
Exactly. You could say that each drop carried the potential to forge a familial connection.
Yeah.
And this attention to detail is what makes the Muwatta such a valuable resource for understanding the intricacies of Islamic jurisprudence.
Right.
It offers these granular insights that reveal the depth and complexity of the legal reasoning.
It's amazing how these seemingly minor details had such profound implications for family structures and social dynamics. It really makes you think differently about something we might take for granted today.
You've touched upon a crucial point. Reflecting on these ancient practices can offer us fresh perspectives on how we view family and kinship in our own time. What stands out to you as the most significant takeaway from our exploration of suckling in the Muwatta?
Well, for me, it's the fluidity of family.
Okay.
In early Islamic society, it wasn't solely determined by blood ties,
Right.
but could be expanded through these shared experiences like breastfeeding. It really challenges our modern assumptions about what constitutes a family and how those bonds are formed.
That's a profound insight. And it also highlights the significant role women played.
Yes.
In shaping these familial networks, they held the power to create these kinship bonds, influencing the very fabric of their society.
Absolutely. It's also been eye-opening to see the dynamic nature of interpreting these religious texts. We encountered these differing opinions and debates,
Yes.
even among the Prophet Muhammad's companions,
Right.
showing that applying these principles wasn't always straightforward.
It reminds us that Islamic jurisprudence is not static,
Right.
but rather an ongoing process of interpretation and understanding, always engaging with the complexities of human experience.
So after this deep dive into the Muwatta Imam Malik,
Yeah.
what can we as modern listeners take away from this ancient wisdom?
I think it encourages us to ask ourselves, how do we define family today? How has that definition changed over time? What role does biology play in our understanding of kinship? And can chosen bonds be as strong as blood ties? These are questions worth pondering, especially in a world where family structures are becoming increasingly diverse.
It's a reminder that while these practices might seem distant from our modern lives,
Yeah.
the underlying themes of kinship, belonging, and the complexities of human relationships are timeless and universal.
Exactly. The Muwatta offers us a glimpse into a different time and a different way of structuring family,
Right.
prompting us to reflect on our own values and how we create those vital bonds of connection in our lives.
It's been a fascinating journey exploring the Muwatta's insights on suckling and kinship.
It has.
Who knew that something as seemingly simple as breast milk could have such profound social and familial implications?
It's a testament to the richness and depth of these ancient texts.
Absolutely.
And as we conclude this deep dive, I encourage you to keep reflecting on these ideas.
Yeah.
How does this ancient wisdom resonate with your understanding of family and kinship?
We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah.
Feel free to share your reflections and continue the conversation beyond this deep dive. Until next time, may your pursuit of knowledge continue to expand your horizons